This is The Veldt by Ray Bradbury, and that is all who made the presentation. This is the author's background. Ray Bradbury was born August 22nd, 1920 in Waukegan, Illinois. He is best known for his highly imaginative stories that blend a poetic style, nostalgia for childhood, social criticism, and an awareness of the hazards of runaway technology. Later in his life, he moved to Los Angeles, California, where he joined the Los Angeles Science Fiction League. One of Bradbury's most famous works is Fahrenheit 451. He also wrote many other stories such as The Foghorn, A Sound of Thunder, and Dandelion Wine. Along with writing stories, he wrote scripts for movies and shows. He worked on his first major screenplay was for the film Moby Dick, which then made him in high demand in Hollywood. And then he went on to write scripts for Playhouse 90, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and The Twilight Zone.
The short summary. The Veldt is a story about two parents, George and Lita Hadley, who raised their two kids, Peter and Wendy, in a very technologically advanced house that does everything for them. And they have a nursery that projects whatever environment the person is feeling. They made this for their kids to see what emotions and feelings they had while in the nursery. And the parents, George wants to shut it down because he wants to try living without the technology helping them out all the time. Before he does, he has a psychologist come by, David McLean, who's a friend of theirs, to inspect the room because they've been suspicious, the children have. And when he checks the room, he tells them that the house and the room have replaced them, as the house is the parents in the children's eyes because they do everything for them, and George and Lita aren't really there to do anything. And he also says he senses real hatred from the nursery. When George shuts it down, the children throw a big fit and beg for their nursery to be in the nursery one more time. And they do. The parents start packing, and then the children call them down. They don't find them. They go into the nursery where the children lock them in. They're surrounded by lions, and then they're presumably eaten. And then David comes back looking for their parents, and he sees them in the nursery overlooking the water hole, and the lions eating, and ends with Wendy asking a cup of tea, and the story ends.
This is the deconstruction lens. I said the opposition in this text depends on whose side of the story you are on. On one side, you have the parents, George and Lydia Hadley. They're trying to turn off the house because they're worried about their children. And on the other side, you have the kids, Wendy and Peter, and they're trying to keep the house on, and they will do anything to keep it on. And I would say that the kids are favored in the opposition because they seem to be controlling the nursery, which can turn to any landscape they think about. And in this instance, the kids have turned the nursery into the African Veldt with hungry lions. And however, if you look at this story from the parents' perspective, you would think that they have the clear advantage in this situation because they have the power to turn the house off. But as we know, it did not work out for them. This is Lens Continued. I said the short story never truly resolved its ambiguities. For instance, the reader is practically thrown into the story with no context. It's only after reading through almost half of the story you figure out that the house they're in is a futuristic smart home. Also, in the ending, still no questions are answered. We don't know how the nursery truly works or what happens to the kids after what they did to their parents, or if the psychologist David McLean knew what the kids just did. And these are my discussion quotes. Who do you think is favored in the opposition, the parents or the children? And do you think the lack of context affects your understanding of the conflict?
So this is the psychological lens. Looking at the story from a psychological standpoint, a lot of the characters' actions and behaviors can be identified and the reason for them acting how they do. For the parents, they wanted a technologically advanced house to live as carefree as possible, but when they have their role as parents taken away, they feel out of place. As David McLean stated, you've let this room in this house replace you and your wife and your children's affection. This room is their mother and father. For a parent to hear that, to be here that they've been replaced, would have a big impact on how they act. This leading to George wanting to shut down the house and to get his role as a parent back. From the children's perspective, all they have known is a carefree life provided by the house. Their parents were there but didn't really do much. When told that they would be able to use the house or the nursery, it was as if their parents were taking away their way of life. The children have been suspicious throughout the story. They lied about being in Africa in the nursery, and David said he felt hatred in the nursery, which is supposed to display what the children think. In the end, the children saw their parents as a nuisance, so they got rid of them to keep their lifestyle. My questions were in the story, the children have become so attached to the house that they do whatever they can to keep it. In our day and age, as technology advances, could we also end up as the children in the story? And if the parents limited the use of the nursery and the house as a whole, do you think the children would be attached or less attached to those things?
Alright, so this is the social power / Marxist lens. So the story focuses on the wealthy spectrum of the economic classes rather than having a rich versus poor dynamic. However, within the wealthy spectrum, the Veldt explores explores a power dynamic between an adult and a child. For example, we can see this play out with a conversation between George and Peter. Peter starts off asking, "Will you shut off the house sometime soon? We're considering it. I don't think you'd better consider it any more, Father. I won't have any threats from my son." Very well. And Peter strolled off to the nursery. George Hadley uses his status as Peter's father to try to control the conversation. In return, Peter scares his father mentally with the threat and hopes to stop his father in his motive. This story is radical. George and Lydia had realized what they've done to their children and now strive to make change. The two had admitted, "We've given the children everything we ever wanted. Is our reward secrecy? Disobedience? They're insufferable. They're spoiled and we're spoiled." This quote ties into the constant behavior patterns Mr. and Mrs. Hadley have presented their kids growing up. In Means of Control, the works of effects shows the consequences on consequences both sides deal with. Wendy and Peter are met with a strong dependency of machinery and say they can't do things without the machine's assistance. George and Lydia are dealt with the responsibility of letting their children become deprived of freedom and being able to do things themselves. Based on the information about Ray Bradley, he's somewhere in the middle class. His parents were Leonard Spalding Bradbury, who worked as a lineman for power and telephone utilities, and Esther Morberg, who was a Swedish immigrant. Growing up in an idyllic childhood, Bradbury would eagerly read adventurous and fantasy types of books and was a huge magician fan. By the age of 12 or 13, Bradbury decided on becoming a writer. These sorts of influences can be seen in the Veldt through the concept of the nursery that heavily relies on one's imagination. The nursery constructs anything Wendy and Peter think of and desire, one being Africa, which is the main setting. the main setting the nursery is stuck on. Though the nursery is capable of change, as the story quotes, he opened the door and found Wonderland, Alice, the Mock Turtle, or Aladdin, and his magical lamp, or Jack Pumpkinhead of Oz, or Doolittle, or the cow jumping over a very real appearing moon. My questions are: how does the social class of the Hadley family affect them as a whole? In other words, if the Hadley family were middle class instead of a wealthy one, how do you think they'd turn out? And number two, where might you see the characteristics of the Hadley family apply in real life?
From the gender feminist lens, George and Lydia Hadley don't take charge and parent their kids because of the machines. Basically, the machines take over their role. The machines make life easier for the parents and the children, so they don't take their roles. George Hadley, the father of Peter and Wendy, spoils them and doesn't take charge and discipline them until the point of taking away the nursery. The father of the family is supposed to be the provider and take care of the conflicts that may arise, but George doesn't do it until it's too late. But nothing's too good for our children, George had said. It's obvious that he cares for his children, but he takes materialistic things to get them to listen to him. George spoiling them and then taking the nursery away led them to have thoughts about death, which in the end killed George and Lydia Hadley. On the other hand, Lydia believes the house is taking over her role as a mother. The machines do everything a mother can do. George says, "You mean you want to fry my eggs for me?" "Yes," she nodded. "And damn my socks?" "Yes." A frantic, watery eye nodding. "And sweep the house?" "Yes, yes, oh yes." Lydia wants to do the chores, which reinforces the gender stereotype that wives do the cleaning. She believes that she doesn't belong in the house. She says, "The house is wife and mother now, and nursemaid." Lydia and George know that the house is taking over their lives and decide to get away from it. And these are my discussion questions right here. If the Hadley family didn't have their happy life home, do you believe their roles as parents would be any different? And the second question is, do you think George Hadley was a good the biographical lens? He went from small town Illinois to Los Angeles, California, where he attended high school. He lived through the Great Depression as a child, and he spent time roller skating through Hollywood looking for celebrities. He is most famously known for his works in fantasy, although often mistaken to his dismay as science fiction. He read mostly science fiction in his youth, and his mentor was Bob Olson, an established science fiction author. His science fiction interest led him down a different path than most writers, and as he was more interested in the human side of the story. His depictions were rarely based on reality. He describes his works as based on the unreal. He likes to really base stories on human emotions, which is very apparent in the Veldt, as the main conflict comes from the immature emotions of the children. Fear and uneasiness drive the plot as the parents take away the nursery, which leads them to their death.
The new criticism or formalism lens. When viewing this short story from a new criticism formalistic lens, it's ambiguous. It seems to be a story focused on Mr. and Mrs. Hadley and their curiosity with the nursery and what their children have said to their surrounding. As the story progresses, it quickly becomes a story about Wendy and a story about being self-destructive and failure. Bradbury attempts to solve these ambiguities by shifting the focus of the story from the parents to the children. This ultimately shows that the story is truly about the children and not the parents. My first discussion question is,
why do you think it is important for Bradbury to make it seem like the parents have power over the children in the beginning of the story? And my second discussion question is, what type of irony is most prevalent throughout the story?
This is the connection to a contemporary issue. I said, this story is about the dangers of technology and how it makes you not think for yourself or do anything for yourself anymore. I think this can be applied in a way to the modern era. Kids are growing up playing on iPads at 3 years old and being completely involved with technology. Another aspect is technology is advancing quite fast these days, and we already don't have to put lots of effort into things anymore. Not as much as compared to the story, where the whole house does literally everything for them, but things are a lot easier now. And times have changed due to technology, and this story shows how technology has changed the world in a bad way. And those are sources, and that is the presentation.